Paris, 1942. Under the weight of occupation, the city no longer smelled of bread and perfume, but of coal, sweat, and silent fear. German flags draped over government buildings like funeral shrouds, and soldiers smoked on street corners with the arrogance of men who believed the city's soul already belonged to them. In a commandeered hotel near Montparnasse, a garrison of 19 soldiers lived in a state of brutal monotony, eating, drinking, and laughing in the shadow of death. At the top of that building lived Commander Otto Reimann, a man both admired and feared within the ranks. His face was smooth, almost serene, yet his eyes carried the cold precision of a man accustomed to seeing flesh not as human, but as matter. To him, victory was a science, and humiliation a form of discipline. Below him, in the basement kitchen that never saw daylight, worked Hélène Moreau, a French woman in her late 40s, large and soft-spoken, with arms reddened by boiling water and years of servitude. Before the war, she had cooked for school children. Now, she cooked for the enemy. Her meals were humble, soups from potato peels, bread stretched with sawdust, yet the soldiers devoured them as if they were feasts. Reimann called her the pig who feeds the wolves. Every night she listened to the boots above her. The walls trembled with drunken songs and the clinking of bottles. Sometimes she could hear laughter followed by sudden silence, the kind that chilled the air. The war had turned men into something unrecognizable, and soon it would do the same to her. It began one night when Commander Reimann entered the kitchen after midnight. The light above flickered, revealing the sweat glistening on his gloves. He said nothing at first, just watched her cut carrots into small, trembling pieces. Then, in his quiet, almost courteous German, he said, "Tomorrow the men will be rewarded. You will prepare not only food, but entertainment." She didn't understand, or perhaps she refused to, but when she met his gaze, that emotionless grey stare, she knew. Reimann smiled faintly. "For the fatherland," he whispered, before leaving her alone in the dark, surrounded by the smell of onions and fear. The morning began with a strange stillness, as if Paris itself held its breath. In the commandeered hotel on Rue de l'Ambre, the usual symphony of boots and shouted orders was replaced by the slow rhythm of anticipation. The 19 soldiers stationed there, men hardened by the Eastern Front and dulled by occupation, had been told by Commander Otto Reimann that tonight would be a night of reward, a celebration of loyalty and obedience. They didn't ask what that meant. They didn't have to. In wartime, pleasure was rationed like bread, but cruelty was abundant, freely distributed to those willing to take it. Hélène Moreau woke before dawn, as she always did, though sleep had not visited her that night. Her body was heavy, her joints aching, yet it was not age that made her slow. It was dread. The words of the commander had nested in her skull, whispering through every motion. "Prepare entertainment." She had not dared to ask. She had simply nodded, as one nods to the sound of a gun being cocked. In war, survival was a matter of silence. But that morning, as she peeled potatoes beneath the dim light of the kitchen, she could feel that something monstrous was already unfolding, and that she unwillingly was part of it. The kitchen smelled of broth and rust. The knives were dull, the pans blackened from years of neglect. Yet she worked with precision, the muscle memory of a woman who had spent her life feeding others. There was comfort in routine, in cutting, stirring, tasting, but today, even the familiar betrayed her. Each clove of garlic crushed beneath her palm seemed to echo like a heartbeat. Every flicker of the oil in the pan reminded her of the eyes that had watched her last night, cold, unblinking, satisfied. She could still feel the commander's breath behind her ear when he said, "For the fatherland." Upstairs, laughter erupted. The men were polishing their boots, shining their medals, telling stories of villages burned, of women crying in foreign tongues. They laughed because laughter was easier than conscience. Their youth had been swallowed by the Reich, their humanity bleached by the uniform. Tonight, they were told, was a celebration of victory, of dominance, a reminder of what it meant to be on the winning side of history. And for that, Reimann would give them something to feed the part of them that the front had not yet starved, the hunger for humiliation, for proof that they could still make someone smaller than themselves obey. By noon, the entire building seemed to pulse with heat. Helene wiped her forehead with her apron, the fabric damp with sweat and tears. A soldier appeared at the door, carrying a crate of wine bottles, French wine confiscated from the cellar of a Jewish merchant. "Commander says to make a stew," he said, his tone almost cheerful. "A big one. Tonight, we feast." She nodded, though her throat was dry. When he left, she stood for a moment, staring at the crate. On one of the bottles was a name etched into the glass, David Levy. She ran her finger over it, then set it aside. The dead had no use for wine. As the afternoon bled into evening, the kitchen transformed into a furnace. Meat simmered, onions caramelized, and the walls seemed to close in. Every few minutes, a soldier would descend the stairs, one asking for a taste, another for a cigarette, another just to watch her work. Their eyes lingered too long, filled not with hunger for food, but for something else. She ignored them, focusing on the bubbling pot, her mind slipping into a kind of numbness. She thought of her home in Montreux, of the bakery where she once worked, of the laughter of children who would never know this war. Those memories were ghosts now, but they kept her standing. At 7 o'clock, the commander returned. His boots were spotless, his uniform pressed. He entered the kitchen without speaking, inspecting her work like an artist reviewing a canvas. "It smells good," he said finally, his voice smooth and empty. "The men will be pleased." Then he stepped closer. "Are you ready, Frau Moreau?" She looked at him, her eyes swollen from the heat. "For what, sir?" she asked, her voice breaking. He smiled faintly, as if amused by her innocence. "For your service to the Reich," he replied. "For the Fatherland." He handed her a folded garment and a white apron freshly washed, but beneath it she saw the faint imprint of another woman's name sewn into the fabric. It wasn't new, it had been worn before, a trace of someone else's life, someone who had perhaps not survived to tell their story. Her hands shook as she took it. Reimann adjusted his gloves, his tone polite but final. "You will remain after the meal," he said. "The men will call for you when it's time." Then, as if to soften the command, he added, "You should be proud. Few civilians are granted the honor of serving so many soldiers at once." When he left, she collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. The room spun. She wanted to scream, to run, to die. But the city outside was full of soldiers, and the walls of the hotel were thicker than prayer. The stew boiled over, spilling onto the floor, hissing like the breath of the devil. She fell to her knees, wiping it with her rag, whispering to herself, "It's just food, it's just another night." But she knew it wasn't. Tonight would carve itself into her body like a brand. As the sky outside darkened, the soldiers gathered in the dining hall. The table was long and narrow, covered in a linen cloth stolen from a church. Candles flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. The men shouted toasts to victory, to Hitler, to life itself. The stew was served, the wine poured, and laughter filled the room. Upstairs, the gramophone crackled with a waltz. Reimann stood at the head of the table, his glass raised high. "Tonight," he declared, "we celebrate not just our triumphs, but our sacrifices. Every soldier here has earned his reward, and tonight that reward will be unforgettable." The men roared with approval. Helene stood in the doorway, watching them eat. Her hands were raw from cooking, her apron stained. She could feel their eyes crawling over her, stripping her of what little dignity the uniform of servitude had left her. Reimann's gaze met hers for a moment, calm, commanding, inhuman. Then he nodded to one of the soldiers, who disappeared down the hall and returned carrying a chair. They placed it in the center of the room. "Stay," said the commander quietly. Helene didn't move. Her heart pounded so violently that she thought it would stop. She wanted to faint, to vanish, but her body betrayed her, rooted in place by terror. The soldiers watched, their faces twisted in drunken hunger. Reimann poured himself another glass of wine and sat, crossing one leg over the other with the composure of a man watching an opera. "Gentlemen," he said softly, almost tenderly, "let us begin our entertainment." The room erupted in applause, and in that moment, as the laughter drowned the sound of her trembling breath, Hélène understood that the war was not only fought with bullets and bombs, it was fought in rooms like this, where the human soul was the battlefield, and mercy was the first casualty. Outside, the bells of Saint-Sulpice rang the hour. Midnight. The feast of hunger had begun. The night settled over Paris like a suffocating cloth. From the rooftops, the city looked asleep, but its silence was only the exhaustion of survival. A silence broken now and then by the low growl of German trucks patrolling the boulevards or the dull clang of church bells that no longer called for prayer. In the commandeered hotel, the windows glowed an eerie yellow, and inside, shadows moved like figures in a fever dream. The banquet had begun. The smell of food lingered in the air, thick with grease and wine. The soldiers, their faces already red from drink, slammed their cups against the table and shouted songs that had once stirred patriotism, but now only celebrated domination. Commander Otto Reimann sat at the head, his posture immaculate, his gloves removed, his fingers resting elegantly on the rim of a glass half filled with Burgundy. His eyes, however, were fixed on Hélène. She stood at the edge of the room, the sweat from the kitchen still clinging to her hairline, her apron stiff with stains. She looked out of place among the polished uniforms, a grotesque reminder of everything the Reich sought to control and despise. "Bring her forward," Reimann said softly, his tone almost kind. Two soldiers obeyed immediately, pulling Hélène closer to the center of the hall. Her feet scraped against the floor. She wanted to resist, to scream, but her body betrayed her, frozen by the mechanical obedience born from terror. Around her the men jeered, whistled and laughed. One of them placed his cap on her head, another tore the ribbon from her apron. They shouted words in German she didn't understand but could feel, words that stripped her faster than hands could. Reimann raised a hand, and the laughter died. The silence that followed was worse. He stood adjusting his uniform with the precision of a surgeon. "Tonight," he began, his voice low but clear, "we honor the spirit of the Fatherland. Our bodies are its weapons, our will its purity. Even in this city of decadence, we must remember what we are fighting for. Control, order, discipline." He turned to her, his expression almost solemn. "And sometimes the enemy must learn to serve that order." The men roared again, pounding their fists on the table, shouting her name. Not Hélène, but the nickname they had given her, La Truie, the sow. She could barely hear them. Her pulse filled her ears. The commander gestured to the chair in the center of the room, the one they had placed earlier. "Sit," he ordered. When she didn't move, two soldiers forced her down. The wood creaked under her weight. Reimann circled her slowly, like a professor lecturing before a specimen. "Look at her," he said to his men. "She feeds you. She warms your bellies. Tonight she will remind you why you fight, to dominate, to conquer, to cleanse." His words sliced the air. The soldiers shouted, some rising to their feet, drunk on power and wine. He turned back to her, his face close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Do you understand your duty tonight?" he asked in French. She shook her head, tears spilling silently. His smile returned, that faint, almost elegant smile that masked the rot beneath. "You will," he whispered. What followed was not chaos, it was organized cruelty, each movement rehearsed, each command deliberate. Reimann stood back, orchestrating the scene like a conductor, his men following the rhythm of his authority. There was no laughter now, only breathing, heavy, animal, synchronized. The candles flickered, throwing monstrous shapes on the walls. In that narrow room, the line between soldier and beast dissolved entirely. And in the middle of it all, Hélène disappeared, not her body but herself, swallowed whole by the machinery of obedience. At some point she stopped struggling. The noise blurred into a single droning hum like a distant train. She stared at the ceiling, where the plaster cracked in the shape of a cross, and tried to count each fissure. Somewhere far away, a radio played a soft tune, a waltz distorted by static. It reminded her of the school canteen where she once served soup to children. Their faces flashed before her, small hands, clean spoons, laughter. Then the memory dissolved into the present, into the smell of sweat and wine and iron. When it was over, the men slumped back into their chairs, their laughter returning, louder now, uglier, Reimann remained standing, his uniform untouched by the filth around him. He poured another glass of wine, raised it slightly and said, "For the Fatherland." The men echoed it, their voices hoarse and triumphant. Then they returned to their food as if nothing had happened, chewing noisily, spilling gravy across the tablecloth. Helene lay still on the floor for a long time. No one looked at her. She could hear the scrape of knives, the pop of corks, the shallow breathing of exhausted men. At last, Reimann crouched beside her, his expression unreadable. "You have done your duty," he murmured, almost tenderly. "France should be proud." Then he stood, straightened his coat and left the room. 2 soldiers were ordered to dispose of her. They lifted her beneath the arms and dragged her toward the kitchen. Her shoes scraped along the tile, leaving faint red smears. In the kitchen's dim light, she caught her reflection in a steel pot, her face pale, swollen, unrecognizable. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. The soldiers dropped her beside the stove, laughing as they left. One of them tossed a crust of bread near her feet. "For your trouble, Truey," he said before slamming the door. For a while, the only sound was the soft bubbling of the pot she had left on the fire. The stew still simmered, its aroma heavy in the air, the same meal she had made to feed them. She stared at it, her mind strangely clear, as if hovering above her own body. Everything, the orders, the humiliation, the laughter, all felt distant, like the echo of a dream that refused to end. She tried to stand but collapsed again, her legs refusing to obey. When dawn arrived, the soldiers were asleep, their snores echoing through the corridors. The building smelled of wine, sweat, and smoke. Helene dragged herself to her feet and looked toward the window. The first light of morning spilled into the kitchen, pale and indifferent. Outside, the city stirred, bakers opening their shops, milkmen delivering bottles, life resuming as if the world had not changed overnight. She envied them, their ignorance, their small mercies. On the counter lay a knife, its blade dull but sharp enough to cut through bread or skin. She picked it up, her hand steady. For a moment, she imagined walking upstairs into the commander's room, pressing the blade against his throat. She imagined the shock in his eyes, the blood blooming like wine across his collar. But the vision faded. What would it change? The war would still go on. Men like Reimann would multiply like shadows. Her act would vanish into the fog of history. Instead, she took a small piece of paper from the wall, an old ration notice, and wrote a single line on it with the commander's pen. "Even pigs know when the feast is over." She placed it beside the pot, then turned off the stove. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were calm. For the first time in months, she felt control, not victory, but defiance. When the soldiers awoke hours later, the kitchen was cold. The pot was empty. The chair in the dining hall still stood in the center, a silent monument to the previous night's celebration. Commander Reimann entered the kitchen, his face expressionless, and saw the note. He read it twice, his jaw tightening. Then he folded it neatly, slipped it into his pocket, and ordered the men to prepare for inspection. Outside, Paris went on pretending. But beneath the streets, in that stolen hotel, the war had claimed another soul, not through bullets or bombs, but through something quieter, deeper, and far more permanent. The following days unfolded like a fever without end. The hotel that had once echoed with drunken laughter now felt haunted by something the soldiers could not name. The walls seemed to breathe differently. The air had thickened, as though it too had absorbed the stench of what had been done. Commander Otto Reimann kept his composure, as he always did, moving through the corridors with the elegance of a man incapable of shame. Yet behind the precision of his movements, something in him had shifted, not remorse, but a new kind of vigilance, the kind born when a man knows he has crossed a line even his own darkness hadn't imagined possible. Hélène Moreau was never seen again. The soldiers assumed she had fled during the night, a story they told themselves because it was easier than the truth. No one asked where she could have gone, or how a woman of her size, limping and bruised, might have escaped a city swarming with patrols. A few muttered that she had been relocated, a word that had come to mean many things during the occupation: prison, deportation, or a shallow grave somewhere beyond the Seine. In the official report, Reimann simply wrote, The cook abandoned her post. A single line to bury a human life. Yet something lingered. In the days that followed, the men grew restless. Meals no longer satisfied. The wine no longer burned. Some claimed the kitchen was cursed. They said they heard noises in the night, the clatter of pots when no one was there, the faint scent of stew drifting through the corridors long after the fires were cold. One of the soldiers, Private Kruger, swore he saw her shadow in the pantry, bent over the stove, whispering in French. Another found a smear of grease shaped like a handprint on the dining table the next morning. Ryman dismissed it all as drunken imagination. But he too had begun to wake at night, sweating, certain that he could hear footsteps pacing below his room, slow and deliberate, matching the rhythm of a beating heart. War has a way of swallowing the moral boundaries of men until nothing remains but appetite. But after the feast comes the rot. And rot, unlike pleasure, does not fade. Within a week, 2 of the soldiers fell ill with fever. Their skin turned pale, their eyes yellow. The doctor said it was food poisoning from spoiled meat, yet no one had eaten anything new. Another man hanged himself in the lavatory, his face blue, his boots still polished. On the mirror above the sink, someone had written in steam, "The feast is not over." Ryman ordered the writing removed and forbade the men from speaking of it again. He knew what fear could do to discipline, and discipline was the last thread holding his unit together. But fear is an infection, and once introduced, it multiplies. By the second week, half the men refused to sleep in the hotel, choosing instead to patrol the streets or drink themselves into stupor. The silence of the building had become unbearable. One night, during an air raid, Ryman descended into the basement, the same kitchen where Helen had worked. The walls were cracked, the air damp. The stove stood cold, the pot still on it, rusted now, its surface covered with dust. He approached it slowly, his boots echoing in the stillness. When he lifted the lid, he found it empty, except for a small piece of paper curled inside, yellowed by heat. It was the note she had written. "Even pigs know when the feast is over." He stared at it for a long time, his gloved fingers trembling. The handwriting was faint, almost erased, but the words still bled meaning. Something tightened in his chest. Not guilt, but the unmistakable sting of being seen. He tore the note into pieces, threw them into the fire, and watched them burn. But as the last corner blackened, he thought he saw the ink shimmer, as if refusing to disappear. The next morning, one of the officers from the Gestapo arrived with new orders. The front was collapsing, and the Paris garrison was to prepare for retreat. Ryman was instructed to destroy all local records, including personnel files, requisition orders, and incident reports. He complied without question. Paper after paper fed the flames, the ash rising like grey snow. Among the files was the single line about the cook. The cook abandoned her post. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before tossing it into the fire, but as it burned, a faint smell of stew filled the room. One of the soldiers coughed and muttered, "She's still cooking." The others laughed nervously. Ryman said nothing. When the Germans finally withdrew from Paris in August 1944, they left the hotel in ruins. The locals who entered after liberation found the dining hall destroyed, the furniture overturned, the piano splintered. In the basement, the stove had cracked from the heat and the walls were black with soot. On the floor amid the rubble, someone found the remains of a woman's apron, the name H. Moreau stitched faintly on the hem. The French authorities assumed she had been executed or taken to a camp. Her name appeared briefly on a list of missing civilians and was then forgotten. But memory, like guilt, survives in strange places. After the war, the hotel was restored and reopened as a small boarding house. Guests complained of sleepless nights. Some swore they heard pots clanging in the kitchen when no one was there. Others claimed to smell broth cooking in the dark. A caretaker once said he saw a large woman standing near the stove, her back turned, humming a song no one could identify. When he called out, she vanished, leaving only the faint trace of steam on the air. Commander Otto Ryman survived the war. He escaped capture and reappeared in Hamburg under a new name, working quietly as an administrator for a pharmaceutical company. To his colleagues, he was a polite, disciplined man, precise in speech and manner. Yet, those who knew him closely said he never attended company dinners. The smell of food made him pale. He ate alone, always in silence. One winter evening in 1953, he was found dead in his apartment, seated at the dining table. There was no sign of struggle. The cause of death was heart failure. But on the table beside his untouched plate, the police found a small folded piece of paper, old and yellowed, the ink smeared but legible. It read, "For the Fatherland." No one could explain how the note got there. The handwriting did not match his own. After his death, the boarding house in Paris closed again. The owners claimed it was due to financial reasons, though neighbors whispered about the noises, the smells, and the way the basement door sometimes opened on its own. Eventually, the building was demolished. Yet, during construction of a new apartment complex, workers uncovered human remains beneath the foundation, bones belonging to a woman, broad and short, her skull fractured, her jaw missing several teeth. Alongside her bones was a rusted kitchen knife and a small metal tag engraved with the German eagle. The city coroner marked the discovery as inconclusive. The remains were buried in a communal grave outside Paris, unclaimed and unnamed. But for those who lived nearby, the story persisted. They said that when the wind was right, you could still smell the faint aroma of stew drifting through the alley. Some claimed it was only imagination, a trick of memory. Others said it was her, still cooking, still feeding the men who had devoured her life. And somewhere, perhaps in that scent, the truth lingered, that the war had not ended when the guns went silent. It lived on in the walls, in the air, in the invisible weight of what men choose to forget. The Fatherland had taken everything from her, her body, her name, her dignity, and in return, she had left behind something far heavier: remembrance. A curse disguised as a story, a haunting disguised as history, and that perhaps was her final act of resistance. Decades passed, and Paris remade itself with the arrogance of forgetting. Streets were cleaned, walls were repainted, and history, the kind that stank and bled, was buried beneath the cobblestones. The hotel on Rue de l'Ombre no longer existed. In its place rose a new apartment building, with white facades, symmetrical balconies, and polished brass doors that reflected the sun like nothing sinister had ever lived there. The tenants were young couples, students, bureaucrats. They spoke of the war as if it were a distant myth, something that had happened in black and white to people who no longer resembled them. But the walls remembered, even if no one else did. The walls had listened. The walls had watched. In 1974, the basement of the building was converted into storage. Old bicycles, dusty boxes, forgotten tools, the typical debris of civilian life. No one knew what the space had once been. The architect had sealed off the section where the stove had stood, claiming structural instability. The tenants laughed about ghosts when the lights flickered, but there were moments late at night when the air in the stairwell grew thick with a smell that didn't belong. Not mold, not dust, but something almost warm, almost edible. A scent of onions, broth, and despair. Those who smelled it swore it made them nauseous, as if it wasn't food but memory itself rising from the floor. One of the tenants, a young journalist named Emily Durand, noticed it first. She was 27, curious and unburdened by superstition. She had moved into the building precisely because it was old. She loved history, the feeling of being surrounded by traces of other lives. Yet something about that place unsettled her. Her apartment was directly above the old kitchen, and on certain nights she could hear faint sounds, a metal clank, a slow stirring, and once, unmistakably, the whisper of a woman's voice. She thought it was the pipes at first. Then she thought it was exhaustion. But when the smell came, dense and unmistakably of stew, she began to wonder what kind of story she was living inside. Emily worked for a small cultural magazine. Her editor liked articles about forgotten corners of Paris, abandoned tunnels, sealed metro stations, lost cemeteries. So when she decided to investigate her own building's past, it felt like fate. She started at the city archives, digging through files that no one had opened in decades. There she found a property record from 1941 naming the address as requisitioned by the Wehrmacht for temporary lodging. Attached to it was a single page marked confidential, catering services provided by local civilian H. Moreau. No first name, no date of termination, just a cross drawn next to her name, faintly penciled by an unknown hand. Something in that cross made her heart skip. It wasn't official, not part of the document, just a small human gesture of finality. A cross drawn for someone erased. Her curiosity became obsession. She spent weeks tracing the fragments, police records, military logs, even testimonies from civilians after the liberation. Each document offered glimpses, but never the whole face of the story. There were rumors of a commander named Reimann, of a dinner that had gone wrong, of a woman who disappeared. One file mentioned a note found in the rubble. Even pigs know when the feast is over. It was filed under miscellaneous incidents, morale management. Emily couldn't explain why the story clung to her. Perhaps it was the smell that still rose through her floorboards, or perhaps it was the realization that this woman, Hélène Moreau, had existed only to be devoured and forgotten. That realization was heavier than fear. It was shame. One night, unable to sleep, Emily descended to the basement with a flashlight and her tape recorder. The light cut through the dust like fog. The air was cold and wet, and her steps echoed. She passed the bicycles and boxes, reaching the sealed wall at the back, the one the architect had covered decades earlier. It looked ordinary, but something about it felt wrong. The plaster was cracked, uneven, as though something behind it was pushing to get out. She pressed her palm against it and felt, absurdly, warmth. Then she heard it. The faint scrape of metal on metal, followed by a soft, bubbling sound. The smell hit her immediately, thick, savory, impossible. She stepped back, the flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called out, her voice small. No answer, just the slow rhythm of a wooden spoon stirring. She turned and fled upstairs, heart pounding. But later that night in bed the sounds returned, not from below but from inside her head. She dreamed of a kitchen lit by candlelight, of a pot simmering endlessly, of a woman's back turned to her. In the dream, Emily called out, but the woman didn't respond. When she finally turned around, her face was not a face at all, just steam rising from where it should have been. The next morning, Emily tried to laugh it off, but something in her apartment had changed. The smell lingered, faint but persistent. On her table, she found a single line written in dust, as if traced by a fingertip. For the Fatherland. She moved out a week later. Years passed. The building changed owners again. New tenants arrived, bringing with them televisions, microwaves, and lives too busy to notice ghosts. Yet the legend of the phantom cook spread quietly through the neighborhood. Old residents spoke of her in whispers. La cuisinière de la guerre, the cook of war. Some said she appeared in mirrors, others that she was heard humming old French lullabies. The younger generation laughed, dismissing it as urban folklore. But there were nights, especially in winter when the air turned heavy, when the scent returned undeniable and wrong. In 1992, during renovations, construction workers unearthed something unexpected behind the old wall, a rusted cooking pot, its lid fused shut. The foreman ordered it thrown away, but one of the workers, a superstitious man from the south, insisted on opening it first. They pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, instead of ash or debris, was a single folded scrap of paper, preserved against all logic. The ink had bled with time, but the words were still visible. She cooked for 19 men. They ate and lived. She was fed to the silence. The newspapers ran a small story about it. Most readers dismissed it as apocrypha, another myth of the occupation years. But in the archives, an unnamed historian connected the discovery with the missing civilian Hélène Moreau and the vanished commander Reimann. His report ended with a line that echoed through every file of atrocity, every silence too convenient to question. History does not record the smell of stew, but it lingers longer than gunpowder. Today, the building stands quietly on Rue de l'Ombre, surrounded by cafes and tourists who speak of Paris as if it were eternal beauty. They sip coffee over the ground that once absorbed human shame. The light through the trees looks soft, forgiving. Yet at dusk, When the last cafe closes and the street grows empty, the air sometimes shifts. A wind rises from nowhere, carrying with it the faintest scent. A smell both comforting and unbearable, the smell of something cooked too long, with sorrow instead of salt. No one alive remembers her face, no photograph survives. But her story somehow endures, not in textbooks or memorials, but in the collective unease of a city that still pretends to sleep. The people who live there today often say they feel watched in the stairwell, as if the building itself holds its breath each night. Perhaps it does. Perhaps it still listens for her, for the sound of a wooden spoon against a pot that will never go cold. And so what began as an act of cruelty became something else entirely. A haunting not of vengeance but of remembrance. A reminder that the smallest lives, the erased and humiliated, can still echo louder than the victors who wrote the history books. This was one of the thousands of stories buried beneath the ruins of the Second World War, the kind that survives not in ink, but in air. If you've listened this far, remember her. Remember the silence she was fed to. And if you wish to uncover the other stories that history tried to bury, subscribe, comment, and share this story so that Hélène Moreau's name, and those like hers, will never be erased again.